with the latest on the corporate front, all the market trends, expert opinion, and sound business advice. It is your unique window into the business world, direct from the heart of China.
Hello and welcome to Biz Today. I'm Zhao Yang in Beijing. Coming up, we'll have half an hour of business news and analysis. On today's show, China unveils new policy measures to support childbirth. What are the new focuses? And the EU has decided to increase tariffs on Chinese-made EVs. So what are the implications? And now let's begin with our top story. China has unveiled new birth support policy measures to promote the building of a birth-friendly society. A new derivative from the State Council detailed 13 measures to enhance childbirth support services, expand childcare systems, and strengthen support in education, housing, and employment. Measures also include promoting a new culture of marriage and childbirth and advocating positive views on marriage, parenthood, and family. So what's the reasoning behind these supportive measures, and how will this affect Chinese society, and what's the possible impact on the Chinese economy? For more on this, join us on the line now are Chen Jiahe, Chief Investment Officer at Novum Archi Technologies, and also Yan Liang, Professor of Economics, Willamette University. So I will start with you. So China has unveiled comprehensive policies to enhance the birth support. So what's the background of it, and what are the main factors being considered in this decision?
Right. So the main reason has to do with the fact that China has experienced 2 consecutive years of shrinking population. And right now, population that are aged 65 or above, it's about 14% of population. And so that would, indicate that China is now a moderately aged society. And population aging is going to accelerate. So about 300 million Chinese citizens now are aged 60 or above. And that number is going to approach to 500 million by the mid of the century. So by the time, then seniors would expect to account for about 35% of the total population. And so there is the population aging process, and the fertility rate has been low. Right now, China's fertility rate of the childbearing age women, it's 1.3. So that is lower than a 2.1, which is needed to have a net population, sort of the no growth, but no decline. So in that sense, I think it is time for China to try to boost birth rates. And China has been actually start doing it back in 2013 when it allowed couples to have second child if one of the parents is an only child. And by 2016, it has allowed married couples to have 2 children. And that basically marked the end of the decades-long of one-child policy. And it was just 2021, it announced support for couples who wish to have a third child to be supported in that family decision. And now comes this very comprehensive 13 targeted measures to enhance childbirth services, expand childcare systems, strengthen support in education, housing, employment, and foster birth-friendly social atmosphere. So this is a continuous of the policies and trying to, in some ways, encourage more childbirths, and in some ways to decelerate that population aging process.
So Jiahe, as you mentioned, there are a slew of measures, including, enhancing the childbirth supportive services and expanding the childcare system, strengthening the education, housing, and employment support. So what are your main takeaways from this plan?
Well, when we look at these policies, China is actually, using all its sources to encourage the having of more children. And if we look at these policies, we can see a very similar pattern compared with countries such as Singapore and Japan or South Korea. Because if you look at these Asian developed economies, which is including the above names that I've mentioned, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, what you can see is that the birth rate is actually pretty low in all these societies. And China is actually copying these policies, which include removing all the restrictions on birth, which we had before when we had too much population and too low the economy. giving a lot of subsidies to people who give birth and reducing the burden on education, which is very critical because when I talk to many people saying, well, why don't you have more kids? The answer would not be people say that, okay, I don't have enough money to feed them. It's not possible because China's per capita GDP is now about 13,000 USD, which is a developing country and quite a rich developing country. But people would say that, okay, I have more kids and their education burden will be too much. I worry that they might not be able to get to university degree. They might end up with a high school degree. Where Chinese people are so focusing on education, everyone wants their kids to have university degree. And this put a lot of burden on parents. And China has been doing a lot of job in removing the education burden, the burden with examination, all sorts of things. For example, if you go to talk to the kids with schools, I think it's before the age of 10, it's not allowed to rate the students' scores compared with other students, so that you don't feel the pressure from school when you are too young. So, I mean, all these things are really aiming at helping the birth rate of China.
So what are your main takeaway from the plan? Better enforcement of maternity leave policies and more generous childcare subsidies. Do you think those will help encourage people to have more children?
Right. So I think what seem to be really helpful in this slew of measures are the ones that are, for example, improve the accessibility of childcare services, also to provide more educational, housing, employment support for families. And I think I echo what Jiahe was talking about, that education is usually a big concern for families. We know the fact that the Chinese households spend on average 17% of their annual income on education. And in some of the big cities, that percentage is way higher than the 17%. And so that really, surpassed Japan, Mexico, and the United States by a very significant margin. So I think, that educational costs and the concern of this kinds of prospective education and employment opportunities in the future in many ways would, discourage families, right, from having children. The other thing I think also very important in what you just mentioned, ensuring, maternity leaves and protection of, female workers and ensure, more subsidies for families. And all of this, I think, would also help to, encourage families to have children, because that really provides some kind of security, some kind of cushion for families to think about childbearing and child raising. That said, though, I think these kinds of policies have been implemented in various countries, South Korea, for example, Germany, and they only work in a sort of marginal way, right? But at the same time, I think, again, this is just one, I would say, small piece, right, of the much bigger packages when it comes to encouraging childbirth. And I think, a lot definitely can be done. For example, not just at the beginning of the educational sort of journey, right, that you provide better childcares and so on and so forth, but you could also work towards the entire life cycle of the children, right? So that means other higher level of education. So again, China right now, the government is spending about 3.3% of GDP on education, and that is actually lower than the OECD's average of 4.8% of GDP. So I think, investing more in education and really allow, the young people to have good jobs and stable income going forward, I think that would also, take some of the, anxiety, right, off these parents' mind. So I think, there's more can be done, but this is definitely a step towards the right direction.
So Jiahe, both you and Yan actually mentioned the education. It is also mentioned in the document, and there is a mention in the document of gradual expansion of the scope of free education. So what's the message here, and what do you think the government should do on the education front?
Well, as I've been talking about in the past for quite a long while, the education is actually one of the reasons why many parents are not thinking about having more kids, because they just put too much focus on the fact that if you get a university degree, then you're kind of a complete kid, and if you don't get that, and you get a primary school or a high school qualification only for a lifetime, and you are not that completed a kid. So they stop giving kids and put all their resources into educating their children, which, well, we would say that education is definitely not a bad thing. I mean, China has been growing because we put so much efforts on education. That's why China achieved this economic miracle in the past 4.5 decades, that Chinese people are much better educated than many economies that are having similar per capita GDP, and we got this high growth. That's right. But the thing is that many people are putting their resources onto the education that is not aiming at increasing the real personal ability of their children, but aiming at that their children will get higher scores in examinations so they can get better qualifications at last. This is what we call the examination aiming education, which is not something that we want, because you have this a few million kids going into examination, and if everyone puts more efforts, then people will remain in the same position compared with the other kids, but the overall spending of the society will increase by a very large extent. So that's why China's government is now working very hard toward what we call the quality education, rather than the education basing on the examination scores. We try to say, okay, we want to increase the personal quality of kids, and that means a lot of other things. For example, we don't test all the abilities of kids just by something like the score of their math or Chinese, but we set different targets for different kids, and we put a lot of efforts on like physical exercise. So it's a huge job to do. I mean, there's 1.4 billion people in this country, so it's actually really pretty hard.
So how do you think are housing and employment affecting actually the childbirth decision, and what can be improved in these two areas?
Right. So I think in terms of housing, it's definitely important, right? Because if you want to encourage families to have more kids, you need to be able to provide them with, larger area of housing. And also for migrant workers, I think that is also very essential. If the migrant workers wanted to, settle down in the urban areas and have families, they should be allowed to purchase affordable housing. And I think that would also help to encourage them. When it comes to employment, I think that is also very important. It's not just the youth employment, right? That when the family really help to bring up a child and have education from the college level, we want to make sure that these young people do have good jobs, right? Decent paying jobs. So I think that is important. And another point I think is also in terms of employment, we know that there is the so-called motherhood penalty in the job markets, right? So when you become a mother, you have to take some gap years. And when you return back to the job market, a lot of times women are being discriminated against. And so I think that it's important that if we are able to improve gender equality in the labor market, I think that would take a lot of anxieties of the minds of these prospective mothers. And last but not the least, I think we often think about the declining birth rate as a negative thing. But as a matter of fact, large economics literature has shown that it's usually when the moms, right, have more opportunities, educational opportunities, career opportunities. That's one of the biggest reasons for sometimes women don't want to get married early or have children or have more children. So again, if we're able to really level the playing field, right, and allow mothers to have children and yet still thrive in the workplace, I think that would be really also very encouraging for family to consider childbearing and child raising.
And so, Jiahe, these measures to support the childbirth, what's the possible impact on the Chinese economy?
So what we will have is that we will very possibly have a rebound of childbirth, at least for the next 2 or 3 years. Well, we don't know how long this big impact will be lasting, because what we have seen is that if you look around the world, for those countries with higher and higher GDP, they have lower and lower birth rate. So the problem for China is the same thing, because we have GDP that is rising and rising. We're targeting for like 20,000 or even 30,000 USD per capita. So we will have potential more pressure toward our birth rate in the future. But the government is also doing these countermeasures. So it looks like at least for the next 2 or 3 years, we have higher birth rate. But after that, we'll watch and see. But what we will be having is that because for the economy is that if you have more kids, there definitely will be more consumption. Because nowadays, if you talk to Chinese consumers and parents, they don't really care about how much it costs if they are spending for their kids. That's why many businesses are rushing into this area to make products especially designed for children, because that's really lucrative if you look at these products. So, I mean, more kids is definitely good for the consumption and good for the economy.
So these measures to support childbirth, what do you think is the possible impact on Chinese economy? And what about China's demographic situation?
Right. So I think in general, these kinds of supportive the supportive policies for families, to take some burdens off in terms of educational spending, in terms of support for housing, employment, maternity, leaves, and also importantly, maternity insurance. All of this, I think, would be super helpful for families just in general. But, again, I think in terms of the direct impact on birth rates, it might not be as significant as we would like. But again, this is just one small piece of the, grander sort of policy toolkit. And I also agree with Jiahe. I think in the past 2 years, it has a lot of COVID factors in it. So it's not clear that the population decline is going to be a long-term trend. So I think we still need to be, sort of more balanced and look at the data over a longer term. And I also think that there are some specific sectors like education. We're already seeing some very, bright spots in terms of online education, mobile education, gamification, and virtual reality, and also social media learning. I think the industry is going to continue to grow. And so some of these measures that we try to promote more families, more population, more childbirth, would really strengthen, that kinds of industries, right? And there's also some other consumers, durable goods sector could also be supported indirectly, right, through these measures, and also in terms of, for example, healthcare and so on and so forth. So I think overall it is going to be helpful for the economy. Now, in terms of the second part of the question, the sort of in terms of population and how it relates to the economy. I think it's clear from the supply side, even if the population is shrinking, we're still enjoying the talent dividend, right? The population is much more educated. They have much better skills, and there are also automation in this country, robotization. So I think from the supply side, I'm not worried at all, right? People talk about population time bomb. As a matter of fact, I think if there's any impact, it's not until the mid-century, and the impact is still going to be, manageable. I think more of the question is, how do we think about to structure the economy so we can accommodate a more aging societies? So, for example, the kinds of the services that we provide, the kind of consumer patterns, the kinds of consumer goods that we provide, right? So the silver economy, they have different types of needs, and we need to accommodate for those needs. And there are also different, other needs for society, right? For example, we might have to, pause the red light for pedestrians for longer, right? Because when people are older, it takes a longer time for them to cross the street. So there are all kinds of things that we need to be thinking about when it comes to population aging, especially from the demand side. But I'm not too worried about the so-called dissipating, population dividend as a supply side problem for the economy.
Well, we're speaking with Yan Liang, Professor of Economics, Willamette University, and also Chen Jiahe, Chief Investment Officer at Novum Technologies. And after a short break, the EU has decided to increase the tariffs on Chinese-made EVs. What are the implications? Stay with us.
I am Dan Wang, Chief Economist of Hang Seng Bank, China. The World Today is a real fun program. You will hear interesting people discussing global trend, economic event, what's happening in and outside of China. So, friends around the world, hope you can join us.
You're listening to Biz Today. I'm Zhao Yang in Beijing. The Chinese Commerce Ministry says the country will not accept the European Union's latest decision to levy extra tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Following an anti-subsidy investigation, the EU has decided to increase tariffs on Chinese EVs to as much as 45.3%. The European Commission says it remains open to negotiating prices. A Chinese Commerce Commerce Ministry spokesperson says China has filed an appeal with the WTO and will continue to safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese enterprises. So yeah, actually the European Union has decided to, increase the tariffs on Chinese-made EVs. So could you tell us more details of these extra tariffs?
Right. So the extra tariffs will range from as low as 7.8% for Tesla to as high as 35.3% for SAIC motor. And that is a stack on top of the 10% standard import duty for cars to the EU. So it is in some ways substantial when you think about, as high as, 45.3%, for SAIC, right? That's the 35.3 plus another 10%. That is going to, I think, in some ways affect, right, the SIC's exports of EVs. But there are also other, smaller increase in the tariffs, and given the large price advantages of Chinese EVs, so talking about BYD or talking about Geely's, I don't think this is going to make a big dent in these companies' ability to export to Europe. And I think we're also seeing that it's reflected in, the investors when it comes to the shares of the BYD, for example, and also NIO and XPeng, the stock price didn't really lose that much, right? So I think the market is still confident that, through some transshipment and also diversifying supply chain and increase the capacity outside of China in some of the Eastern European or Central European countries, I think it is definitely manageable, right, for Chinese EVs to cope. But that said, I think China is definitely, as you mentioned, think this is very unacceptable, right, the punitive tariffs. And China's already filed a complaint at the WTO, and they're going to continue to try to have the business negotiations with the EU. So I think it remains to be seen what the next step China would take.
So Jiahe, so for this extra tariff, what's the potential impact on the EU consumers and also the EU, EV industry?
Well, when we look at the impact of this tariff on consumers, it's definitely not a good thing. I mean, if we have been studying the basic economic courses, what we know is that if you have higher tariff, the cost of the tariff is not bad by the exporter alone. Both the exporter and importer will be bearing higher prices. So that means for the consumers in European Union, they will have higher price. So for the consumers, they definitely will find in the future that they have less choices. They will have higher prices. And for those EVs that is exported not from China but from other countries, because the competition from China has been reduced, these companies will be able to ask for a higher price, which is finally will be bared by the European consumers as well. And if you talk about the local new energy vehicle producers, it will give them a breath. What they will have is that they will have less competition in the first time. So that they can grab a much higher amount of market share that is left by the Chinese producers. That's true. But that's another thing is that because they will be lacking of competition, they will not be forced to produce as good things as they were forcing before when they face the direct competition from China. So they will become, I would say, more lazy with their jobs because this protection by tariff is so helpful for them. So this means that if you talk about the long term, like 3 or 4 decades, you will see that the new energy vehicle producers in European Union will be less developed because of this. I mean, if you look at China's economic growth in the past 4.5 decades, ever since 1978, the economic reform, what we've been doing is that we welcome everyone to compete in China. And then we had all these local companies grow out. And now we have one of the strongest economies in the world. We didn't achieve this by adding tariffs. So if you talk about the economy of the European Union, it's the same thing. I mean, you can't achieve economic growth in the long term by adding tariffs.
So do you think these tariffs will actually protect EU's own EV manufacturers? And also, do you think charging the extra tariffs on Chinese EVs will slow down the EU's green transition?
Absolutely. So in terms of the EV industries, I agree with Jiahe. So even though maybe in the short term they get some breathing space, But that would simply, reduce competition, and it will also delay their transition. I mean, when you look at the automakers in Germany, Volkswagen has just announced that they're going to close 3 major plants, the first time in their 87-year history, because they're seeing the internal combustion engine cars have fallen by 500,000 units every year since the pandemic. So it's clear the trend is to moving towards EV. And so the sooner they can make the transition, the better they are for their entire auto industry. And that's why you're also seeing the German car makers are actually criticizing these EU measures because, again, they themselves know this is not a good policy for them to make the transition and also to be able to continue to sell cars to the Chinese market. So on that front, it's not going to be good for their EV production. And second, I think, the fact that they're levying a higher tariff is because they also attempt to, in a way, motivate more Chinese car makers to invest in the European countries, right? And so that they wanted to have more foreign investment from China so they can set up factories and hire local workers. So I don't think they're going to get really the foreign direct investment that they would like to have. And that would also slow down technological spillover and partnership. And I think that is also not conducive to their own business. And in terms of the green transition, I think you're absolutely right. The EU has a very lofty goal. They wanted to phase out all the ICEs by 2035. Right now, the adoption rate for EV is only 16%. So given the current rate, it's very likely they're going to have to miss the target or they have to revise their target. So, with all the burdens on the consumers, because the Chinese EV is typically 20% lower in terms of price and a lot more varieties than their European counterparts. So overall, I think this is going to be bad for their industries, and it's not going to be good for their economic transition to the green, green transportation system.
Well, we're speaking with Yan Liang, Professor of Economics, Willamette University, and Chen Jiahe, Chief Investment Officer at Novum Archi Technologies. And that's all the time we have for this edition of Biz Today. I'm Zhao Yang in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening.